Okay, I think we might be good to get going. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that all right. I'm afraid I can't see anyone else. So throughout, do just shout if you have any questions. And we'll do time for that at the end as well. Just to say as well, thanks very much for coming on what is surely the hottest day of the year so far. So I do really appreciate your attendance today. Yeah, so my name is Jeff Dwan-O'Reilly. I'm an economist in the City Intelligence Unit. And today I'm going to be talking about London's workforce exposure to generative AI. So probably not that surprising to you, but it's a very topical issue. But the story is not always quite so clear as to what's actually happening in our labour market. Every day we get headlines like these, which really swing between a job apocalypse and net new jobs being created. Really depends on the day that you switch in. Yeah, huge variation in the commentary. I personally favourite that one. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is first looking at some of the theoretical channels of how AI might impact unemployment, how we went about trying to quantify London's exposure to Gen AI, looking at the methodology we used and some of the limitations, and then kind of moving on to the findings of that work. And then I want to move on to kind of how does this kind of abstract exposure measure stack up against emerging real-world evidence of AI adoption and impact on the labour market. And to conclude, looking at some potential policy considerations and key takeaways from this research. This work has been good in supporting the Mayor's evidence base for his new AI and jobs task force. And while this will be kind of a quick whistle through some of the key findings, if you are interested in anything that I've said, please do have a look at the report that we published about a month ago, and it's available on the data store. Okay, so with that, move on to some of the theory about how AI might impact unemployment. So there's a number of different channels to which AI or any new technology can impact on labour demand. The first one is kind of blue arrow, in terms of direct effects is around new task creation, where new technology like AI comes in and generates new labour and skills needs for a business. So an example of this that we're seeing already playing out is like an AI engineer, for example, a new role that didn't previously really exist. At the other end of the spectrum, though, we've got task automation, where AI can substitute in for human labour and reduce demand for that labour and risk in job displacement. In reality, though, when new technology comes in, it's rare that it can completely automate away a task. So then we have this kind of middle way, which is where there's a task mix change. AI comes in, or any new technology comes in and complements human skill sets and materially changes roles task mix, often through reducing routine tasks through augmentation of a role. And this can boost productivity for individuals by allowing them to perform their duties faster or to a higher standard. Then we've got these kind of secondary effects, I'll call them. First one is kind of around productivity or scale effects, where as a result of AI, there's increased demand for those more productive AI augmented roles, or for roles that are complementary to those augmented roles. So I just kind of give an example maybe for our own team in the economics team. If the economists become a lot more productive and start to produce 20 reports a year as opposed to 10, for example, we're going to need more people in the press office and our marketing team to help us get those insights out where they need to be. On the flip side, though, we've also got this idea of headcount compression, where fewer AI-enabled workers maybe are required to produce the same output, and that can lead to reduced demand overall. Again, if I give an example from the economics team, if 5 economists are currently producing 10 reports a year, it's not impossible that 3 economists who are quite proficient at using AI could produce the same output into the same standard with a lower headcount cost to the business. In reality, all these effects are likely to be taking place at the same time, often with, as I said, opposing forces, and that can lead to an ambiguous net effect on employment from the theory. So Gen AI is potentially a little bit different from some earlier technological waves that we've seen. And these differences might mean that it's kind of wider, its impact will be wider in scope and maybe also quicker to materialize. First reason for that is that Gen AI capabilities align most with the complex cognitive tasks of white-collar or professional work. And that's kind of a marked difference from some previous technological waves that are really focused on the routine tasks in, say, manufacturing or construction, those kind of things with robotics. So it's a new kind of part of the economy that's potentially impacted that it wasn't before by automation. Second one is just kind of the speed at which Gen AI's capabilities are advancing in such a short period of time since they've emerged just a couple of years ago. So I won't go into this chart too much, but it just shows the kind of task completion times of some of the frontier AI models. You can just see that they're becoming increasingly advanced and capable of completing ever more advanced tasks reliably. I think the latest dot on this chart is kind of a preview of Claude Mythos, which is, again, leaps and bounds above the next nearest model, and it seems to only be increasing in its capabilities with each iteration. And the last one that kind of brings it together and maybe, again, kind of explains why it might be quicker to materialize is that there's quite low barriers to experimentation with Gen AI, both in terms of cost. They're not that expensive to kind of trial out and experiment with at the individual level. And the user interfaces are very intuitive to use for everyone. While it still costs money for the business as a whole to kind of transform their business with AI, at least on the experimentation stage, it's very accessible. And again, that's different to some previous technological waves that we've seen. Okay, but beyond kind of just how capable AI models are at performing different tasks within roles, it's quite fair to say that a wide range of other factors will ultimately determine the employment effects arising from AI in the future. And these are across a number of levels. I won't get into all these are just kind of an example of some. Maybe starting with workers. Obviously, you've got the capability of AI to do tasks, but another one that's very important is if the workforce actually has the complementary skills to kind of reap the benefits of AI. Are they proficient in using AI tools most effectively? Do they have the transferable skills like problem solving, critical thinking, management, leadership, all skills that we know are really important to really execute AI effectively. For businesses, while the rate of adoption is important, it's also how intensely integrated AI is into actual workflows. It's kind of one thing maybe to have a Copilot license for the business, but it's another thing to have it really integrated into specific use cases and redesigning workflows along those lines. And just one example at the societal and wider economy level, I think public trust is really important. Even where AI models are really capable, if there's not public trust in AI-generated outputs, this will probably hold back the actual use case of the technology there. And there's some kind of emerging examples of that in education and sometimes in health as well. So that's an important one, as well as kind of other things like macroeconomic conditions, consumer demand, and just if we have the infrastructure capacity to use AI kind of wider than we currently do. Okay, so that's kind of some of the theory about some of the factors that might impact employment, and then some of the other factors that might hold it back or would be key in seeing the impacts longer term. But I just want to talk a bit about now how we went about quantifying London's AI exposure. So first we considered a wide range of exposure approaches that are out there, and there is quite a lot. But we did settle on one from the International Labour Organization as kind of the basis for this work. And the reason we selected this was, first, it's a kind of task-led approach, so it rates how well Gen AI could perform specific tasks within a role, and that aligns kind of with the theory that I just spoke about, which is really helpful. It provides us with really granular occupation exposure scores that we were able to translate to the UK labour market. So for all of the UK's, I think, 412 occupations, they all have their own exposure level, which is good for our analysis. Third, it's a good approach because it offers some directional guidance on whether the exposure is likely to take the form of either automation or role augmentation. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And finally, really importantly, it's among the most recent methodologies that have been developed, and it kind of captures Gen AI's early 2025 capabilities. As we saw from the chart a few minutes ago, AI's capabilities are evolving really quickly. I think while it's a strength that uses the latest kind of 2025 metrics available, it is also a bit of a limitation, and it can kind of date the analysis a little bit. In saying that, though, we're still pretty confident in the occupations and sectors that we've identified as being most exposed, because the latest AI models still impact the same kind of tasks. So it might be that the exposure is kind of still the same, but maybe more intensely now in those industries and occupations than the analysis even suggests here. This is just kind of a box on how the ILO actually went about estimating the exposure. I won't talk too much about it, but just to say that for the kind of direction, whether or not it's automation or augmentation prone, they take into account the degree and consistency of exposure across tasks in an occupation. Where there's quite a high and uniform exposure, an occupation is more probably automation prone, where AI can do a lot of the tasks, almost all the tasks in that occupation. Where exposure is maybe lower, or where there's a lot more kind of variability in the exposure, some tasks can be automated and some can't, then we tend to think of that occupation as being more augmentation prone, as those kind of non-automatable tasks keep people in the loop. Okay, so what this approach gives us kind of really is this high-level table that shows 5 levels of exposure to Gen AI capabilities, and all the occupations fall within one of these kind of 5 buckets of exposure. I won't talk through all of them, but maybe just highlight a couple. Level 4, the top one here in dark red, is the most exposed group, where there's very high task exposure to the capabilities of AI and low variability across the tasks. So the majority of tasks within those occupations can be automated by AI, and therefore it has the highest potential of automation. The kind of occupations we mean when we see this are administrative or clerical roles, bookkeepers, brokers, those kind of things. The next most exposed, which I'll highlight because I'm in it, is level 3, where there's still a very high level of exposure, but a bit more variability. So there are some tasks that AI can't do, and that kind of keeps people in the loop, and therefore these kind of level 3, 2, and 1 are probably more augmentation prone, although there's still a risk of headcount compression. The kind of things in level 3, economists, software developers, and accountants, for example. And then at the bottom, we've got limited exposure, where there's not that much, AI can't do a lot of the core tasks of these occupations, and there's a lot of variability as well. These are less likely to be impacted by AI automation, although I wouldn't say they're completely immune. These kind of roles include carpenters, care workers, and primary school teachers, all roles that kind of depend on physical presence or context dependent, those kind of things. I can't really stress this point enough, but the occupational Gen AI exposure scores are not forecasts of job losses. Rather, they signal only the technical potential for tasks within roles to be automated by Gen AI. I don't necessarily want to say these are the most at risk of job losses, but levels 4 and 3 are probably the ones where there's the highest potential for at least some disruption as a result of AI. And that'll kind of be the focus of our analysis when we go through the findings as well. So the dark red and the red. Okay. Moving on then to the findings. I just had a quick note here on the kind of data we used for data folks. But to do our analysis, we drew on the ONS's 3-year pooled annual population survey that we accessed through from the SRS. And the reason we use this kind of larger survey, this pool survey, is because it gives us a more robust sample to work with, especially when we're looking at the occupational level. Right. So for London, what's the headline? Almost half London's workers could see their role disrupted in some way by GenAI's capabilities. That's about 46%, or 2.4 million people in those levels 1 to 4. 1 in 5 of London's workforce are in those 2 highest levels of exposure, levels 3 and 4, about 300,000 level 4, 6%, and another 15%, or 750,000 in level 3, as you can see from the pie chart here. There's quite a big share in this limited exposure group, about 54%. They probably are in some way exposed, not to say that they won't use AI or anything. And actually, when the ILO update their exposure methodology next, it's possible that we might see this share shrink as more occupations fall in the scope of AI's capabilities. But they're less exposed compared to the 2025 capabilities, at least. Okay, looking at the occupational mix then, here's quite a wide variation across the occupational groups. The most exposed, though, is admin and the secretarial group, where all roles are exposed to some degree. This kind of makes sense because a lot of the tasks involved in these occupations are kind of routine, well-defined text and clerical processes on a computer that align really well with GenAI's existing strengths. 61% are in that level 4 exposure group, and therefore possibly have a high potential for disruption. The largest occupational groups in terms of overall employment numbers are the professional and associate professional groups, though. They're kind of halfway down in this chart here. Again, these roles often combine a mix of language and analysis-heavy tasks, which aligns, again, well with what GenAI can do. However, a lot of them also require judgment, accountability, interpersonal interactions, and context-specific knowledge that is less automatable. That's why we see relatively low shares in the level 4 exposure group. So these maybe are probably more likely to be augmented with AI. And the least exposed then, as I said before, care and skilled trades roles really, with core tasks are generally physical, in-person, and highly context dependent. Again, not to say they won't use AI in their work. It can really help with some things, particularly the admin work of these roles, like scheduling, for example. But they're not, but they can't automate a lot of the key tasks within these. I won't spend too long on this slide, but just kind of to break down the occupation exposure a little bit more. The chart on the right here shows the largest 25 occupations of employment by their GenAI exposure level. And you can see here that 4 of the top 5 or 6 of the top 10 largest occupations in London are exposed to some degree. The 2 largest, both level 3 exposure, are programmers and software development professionals, as well as finance and investment analysts and advisors. But bookkeepers and admin roles are also well up there. Yeah. Okay. When we kind of look to see where these roles are employed to get kind of a sense of the industry exposure, we see that it's London's industrial strengths really that are most exposed to GenAI. The most exposed industries then are ICT and financial services, both around 77%. Again, this kind of makes sense. Some of the key tasks in these industries include routine compliance checks, claims handling, data modeling, code generation, help desk tickets, and a lot of drafting of documents. I'd probably draw your attention in particular to the finance and insurance one, which has quite a high share in that level 4 group. At the other end of the spectrum, then we've got education, construction, and hospitality. Again, they tend to employ occupations that are physical, in person, and high dependent on in-person activities. I will say though that all industries have some share in that kind of level 4 exposure group, because all industries have at least some degree of back office administration and customer contact functions, which are highly exposed to AI's capabilities. So no sector is immune from AI. And finally, there are some sectors that aren't necessarily hugely exposed to Gen AI specifically, but maybe when Gen AI is paired with other robotic or other technologies, they might have wider implications. The big one that we're focused on here is transport. I suppose having considered the industry mix, it's probably no surprise that when we look at it by UK regions, London is by far the most exposed of any region, 46% compared to 38% for the UK as a whole. Again, that kind of reflects London's status as being a global hub for professional and technological business service activities. Makes sense. And then within London, then it's central London that is definitely the most exposed in terms of its share of employments. Next, then I'm going to move on to some of the characteristics of workers in some of those most exposed roles. Looking first here at education. So here we see the share of employments potentially affected by Gen AI across education levels, and degree level individuals have the highest overall exposure. They've got quite a large share in level 3 and level 2 in particular, which suggests that they're probably the most likely to be impacted by augmentation, but there's also a substantial share in level 4. So some of London's most educated workers really are at this sharpest edge of change and can reap some of the biggest benefits, productivity benefits from AI, but maybe also some disruption as well. Also worth pointing out kind of the relatively high shares for those with A levels or GCSEs as the highest level of educational attainment in that level 4 group. Looking now at some of the demographics and exposure by them, we'll see that it kind of reflects the occupational sorting rather than any group being exposed for any other reason. Looking at age first, we see that London's youngest workers have the highest exposure to Gen AI, in part just because they typically have the highest education levels, which kind of guides them towards professional careers, roles that are most exposed to AI. But it's also that some of the most important stepping stone occupations, like those kind of admin and clerical roles into higher level professional careers, are also very highly exposed, which is why there's quite a high share in that level 4 group. Young people also, though, are digital natives and may be the most adaptable to AI in the longer term, most kind of open to learning it as a skill, things like that. Older workers also have quite a high level of exposure in that level 4 group, so we're kind of keenly aware of them and kind of what supports they might need to reap the benefits of AI or to reskill and challenges there. Looking next at sex, we see women have the highest exposure in that kind of, again, level 3, level 4 groups. This is because they're kind of overrepresented generally in admin and secretarial roles compared to men. And finally, looking at ethnicity, we see Asian and white workers tend to have the highest exposure, reflecting kind of differences in educational attainment, and also their concentration in certain sectors and occupations, like professional occupations and IT in particular. Structural inequalities of opportunity can also explain some of the occupational, the ethnicity differences in terms of exposure as well. And finally, in this section, just to briefly look at exposure differences across earning deciles. It's kind of a U-shaped chart or C-shaped chart maybe, with quite high exposure for some occupations in the highest earning deciles, in that kind of 80-90 percentile, for example. You've got 35% in level 3, and they're 27% in level 2. And it suggests that, while there's probably some degree of disruption there, they're probably more likely to be augmented and therefore reap some strong productivity benefits. On the lower end, though, in the kind of 10 to 30th percentiles, we've got quite high shares in level 4, those roles that are most at risk of automation, those admin and clerical roles. So if those roles are the most disrupted because of AI, then it kind of risks increasing income inequality if the biggest impacts are on the lowest earners. Okay, so that was kind of the theoretical, more kind of abstract exposure analysis that we did. But then we kind of want to follow that up with seeing how it aligns with emerging real-world evidence from firm surveys of AI adoption and online job postings data. So looking first at the UK surveys, we see that adoption from the chart here is growing steadily, but still maybe relatively modest, somewhere between 26 and 35% as of March of this year. And that is almost double where it was 2 years before. When we look at the types of businesses adoption is much higher among larger businesses, compared to SMEs. It's closer to around the 40% mark, 45% mark. Looking at the sectors that are adopting, it aligns quite well with our exposure analysis. ICT, finance and professional services are around 50% adoption, whereas construction, transport and hospitality tend to be much lower. When asked about what roles within their businesses have been impacted by AI, I say impacted, not necessarily lost or anything, but maybe changed. The roles they come back with are creative, admin, and IT and data roles, although there's quite a bit of variation across sectors. Primary uses that businesses report using AI for around text generation, visual content creation, and data processing, all with the intention of improving the efficiency of their business operations. It's interesting, their response to how they're integrating AI. A lot of them are focused on training and retraining their existing staff, rather than automating or replacing roles or recruiting AI specialist skilled staff, although there are aspects of that as well. And finally, kind of when asked for headcount change, the vast majority say that, as of yet at least, they've had no real change in headcount because of their AI adoption, although some are also unsure. A very small number have said that their overall headcount has actually increased with AI, and then maybe 5% that has been a decrease. But this is kind of a metric that we're kind of closely following going forward. When we look at job postings, it's kind of a similar story. We see demand for AI skills growing exponentially, really, particularly in London. As of March this year, again, about 7% of London's online job postings were explicitly seeking AI-related expertise in them. That's kind of more than double where it was 2 years ago and more than triple 3 years ago. London really does lead the way compared to all other UK regions, but again, I think that kind of reflects London's concentration in professional services and its status as an international centre for AI and tech innovation. Before I go on to the next bit, just to kind of recap some of the things that I wanted to look at in this work. We kind of wanted to see was there any emerging evidence of new task creation, changing task mixes, and task automation. So these kind of 3 direct areas, and whether or not job postings could shed some light on these. The first one, the new task creation, we do see new specialist roles are being created as a result of AI. I mentioned AI engineers earlier, and you can see here from this chart that the demand or number of postings in London each month for AI engineers has grown very rapidly again in the last 12 to 18 months in particular. It's not only true of AI engineers, you also see increased demand for things like AI strategy directors and AI forward deployed specialists, things like that, people who come in and integrate AI into your business effectively. These roles are also projected to keep growing in the months and years ahead as well, with increased adoption from businesses. It's also worth saying that AI specialist companies are also growing rapidly, both in the UK and in London in particular. So they're not only hiring AI specialist roles, but also their own kind of marketing, finance, and administration departments. It's a really booming sector at the moment. As of 2024, it accounted for about 86,000 jobs in the UK as a whole, but growing every year. We also find evidence that roles are changing, and AI skills are being sought across a growing spectrum of roles. So the chart here shows the share of occupations. So it shows the occupations with the highest shares of postings explicitly requiring AI expertise in the first quarter of this year, 2026. That's the purple dot. The first quarter of 2025, that's the dark blue dot, and the first quarter of 2019. And you can just see kind of from how it's moved that the biggest growth in AI prevalence in all these occupations really has been in the last 12 months. The occupations that need AI skills most in the eyes of employers at the minute are those kind of digitally focused roles like your data scientists, your programmers, web design professionals, and IT directors. But they're also increasingly appearing across other roles, such as in creative and design, as well as other professionals as well. We see quite high shares in marketing roles, in creative industries, as I said, including graphic designers, and economists as well, about 14% now, but probably higher even now. And finally, there's very tentative evidence so far that demand may be slackening for some of the most Gen AI exposed roles. But that's kind of hard to disentangle from the wider labour market cooling that we've had post the pandemic in the last few years. So the chart on the left here shows kind of the time series of employer demand for all the occupations in the different levels of exposure. And you can see that the most exposed occupational groups have seen the sharpest reductions over recent years in terms of demand. Although they have been, I suppose, broadly stable maybe in the last year or so. Some have actually rebounded, but actually that kind of level 4 group that we're most concerned about, I suppose, has bounced back the least. So while I say it's very tentative and it's not conclusive or anything, again, this is the kind of analysis that we're really looking to track in the months and years ahead. Just to wrap up then, a couple of policy considerations and then a quick run through of the takeaways from the work so far. So some potential considerations for policymakers going forward, kind of based on the literature that's out there. One is to ensure access to, or to ensure that the whole workforce has access to basic AI and visual literacy training, so they can upskill to effectively use AI and be able to reap the benefits that the AI can offer in terms of productivity. Another one is to recognize and develop those complementary or human skills that I spoke about earlier, problem solving, critical thinking, being able to kind of properly assess AI generated outputs, and be able to tell when there's bias or when it's got things wrong. They're all really critical to effectively using AI, particularly at a business level. We've seen that there has been some growth in AI specialist roles, and in the future it may be necessary to develop clearer skill pipelines for these specialist roles, both within further education and higher education. Depending on kind of how AI starts to impact demand for different roles. It might be necessary to target employment supports towards those most exposed roles to ensure they can kind of reskill, upskill, and that progression pathways still exist into good jobs and good careers. And finally, it's important that policymakers kind of pay attention to being able to support employer AI readiness and workplace change, particularly for SMEs who we do hear struggle the most to effectively integrate AI because of their limited resources. So any supports for that group are really important. And just to kind of wrap up some key takeaways, as a summary, overall, the employment effects so far are ambiguous because there's lots of different directions of potential impact from AI. There's potential for new job creation, role displacement, as well as material job change. But to date, the evidence is quite mixed, although maybe all forces are ongoing at the same time. A wide range of other factors beyond just capability of AI models will ultimately determine employment outcomes, as well actually how capable these models get in future. Adoption of AI is growing steadily across the UK and in London in particular, as businesses are actively integrating it into their business operations and redesigning their workflows to make it as efficient and impactful as possible. And they're already starting to recruit the skills that they think they need to have an AI-enabled workforce. London's workforce as a whole faces quite a high degree of exposure to Gen AI, the highest in the UK, with particular concentrations in sectors like ICT, finance, and professional services, which are most likely to employ some of those highly exposed roles where AI can or does meaningfully overlap with their tasks. Impacts are likely to be unevenly spread across the workforce, with young, highly educated, and professional and admin roles potentially most exposed to AI. And going forward, it's probably an imperative to support upskilling among the workforce in AI-specific skills and important common skills so they can best harness AI's potential productivity gains. And employment supports and reskilling opportunities will also be required for those who are the most at risk of being displaced in the future. I think that's it from me, but happy to take any questions on any of those bits. Thank you very much.